In 1933, the federal government told American farmers to stop growing their own wheat. It said it disrupted the market. It said it was unpatriotic. It said it belonged to the regulated economy. Your great-grandmother kept doing it anyway, grinding her own flour on a hand-cranked mill that had belonged to her mother. And here is the part nobody talks about. Modern food security researchers now say small-scale grain production is one of the most effective hedges against supply chain collapse ever documented. The government got it exactly backwards. Number 9 on this list got a Pennsylvania family fined $200 in 1935, an entire month's wages for the crime of feeding their own children. Number 17 was outlawed in 14 states by 1940, and the lobbying group that pushed those laws was funded entirely by industrial food processors, who stood to lose millions. These 25 tricks weren't abandoned because they stopped working. They were abandoned because somebody got rich when you forgot them. Your great-grandparents survived the worst economic collapse in American history using knowledge that took centuries to develop. Then, a generation of regulations and corporate consolidation wiped it out. Before we start, hit subscribe. What you are about to learn is not survival fantasy. It is American history. Let us count down. Number 25, the buried egg crock. Before refrigeration reached rural America, your great-grandmother preserved fresh eggs through winter using a method called water glassing. She filled a stoneware crock with a solution of sodium silicate dissolved in cool boiled water, then carefully lowered in unwashed eggs gathered that morning. The silicate sealed the porous shell. The crock went into the cold pantry or the buried corner of the root cellar, and those eggs stayed edible for 8 to 10 months. A single crock held 7 dozen eggs. The cost was pennies per dozen preserved. The technique was so reliable that the USDA published instructions for it in 1922 and then quietly stopped recommending it after refrigeration manufacturers became major agricultural sponsors. Sodium silicate is still legally sold today as a craft and industrial chemical. Your great-grandmother understood that an egg with its bloom intact was already nature's preserved food. She just helped nature along. The knowledge is sitting in farm bulletins from a century ago, waiting. Number 24. The hand-ground grain mill. Your great-grandfather grew a half-acre of wheat behind the house and ground it himself in a cast-iron mill bolted to the kitchen counter. Fresh ground flour produced bread by supper time that retained its full vitamin E and B complex content. Nutrients that begin oxidizing within 72 hours of milling. Federal Agricultural Adjustment Act regulations beginning in 1933 paid farmers to destroy crops to raise prices, and small homestead grain production was discouraged through quota systems that lasted into the 1950s. The Supreme Court case Wickard v. Filburn in 1942 ruled that a farmer growing wheat for his own family was engaged in interstate commerce and could be federally regulated. That ruling still stands. A hand mill costs under $80. The math has not changed. Number 23. The sourdough starter that lived for generations. Your great-grandmother kept a clay crock on the back of the wood stove containing a wild yeast culture started by her mother. That single starter raised every loaf of bread the family ate for 40 years. The wild yeasts and lactobacillus bacteria produce phytase, an enzyme that breaks down anti-nutrient phytic acid in wheat, making the bread significantly more digestible than commercial yeast bread. Modern celiac researchers have documented that traditional long-fermented sourdough is tolerated by many people who cannot eat industrially produced bread. The starter cannot be regulated. It is a living culture you cannot patent. The knowledge of how to maintain one through years of daily use nearly died with the generation that lived through the Depression. Number 22. The home-cured ham in the spring house. Every November, your great-grandfather salt-cured the hindquarters of a hog using nothing but coarse salt, brown sugar, and patience. The hams hung in the cool darkness of the spring house from January through summer. No refrigeration, no nitrates beyond what occurred naturally in the salt. The technique is called dry curing, the same method used to make Italian prosciutto, which sells today for $40 a pound. The USDA's modern meat regulations require sodium nitrite for commercially sold cured meats. Home production for personal use remains legal in all 50 states. A 22-pound ham requires about 2 pounds of salt and 4 months of cool, dark storage. Your great-grandfather did this every year. The shelves of his spring house held next year's protein. Number 21. Lye soap from rendered fat and wood ash. First pattern break. When Procter & Gamble launched mass-marketed ivory soap in 1879, it deliberately campaigned to make homemade lye soap seem dirty, dangerous, and embarrassing. Newspaper ads in the 1930s showed dignified women rejecting old-fashioned soap in favor of factory-made bars. They did not tell you that homemade lye soap, made from rendered tallow and potassium hydroxide leached from hardwood ashes, is one of the most effective skin-friendly cleansers ever developed. It contains no synthetic detergents, no petroleum fragrances, no antimicrobial chemicals later linked to thyroid disruption. The FDA banned triclosan and 18 other antibacterial chemicals from consumer hand soap in 2016 after research suggested they were doing more harm than good. Your great-grandmother made soap twice a year in a cast-iron kettle in the yard. The lye she leached herself, the fat came from the November butchering. A year's supply for a family of 8 cost essentially nothing. Number 20. The buried haybox cooker. Your great-grandmother brought a pot of beans to a hard boil on the wood stove, then carried the covered pot outside and buried it in a wooden crate packed tight with hay. 6 hours later, those beans were perfectly cooked, having retained enough heat to continue simmering inside their insulated nest. No fuel was used during those 6 hours. The technique cuts cooking fuel use by approximately 70% for any long-cooked dish. There is no regulation against this method because nobody thought to write one. A modern haybox can be built from an insulated cooler for under $20. The energy savings during a long Depression-era winter were the difference between having enough firewood to last until spring and running out in February. Number 19. The homemade vinegar barrel. Your great-grandfather kept an oak barrel in the cellar with a wooden tap and a piece of cheesecloth tied over the bunghole. Apple peels and bruised fruit went in all summer. By autumn, the barrel held 5 gallons of strong apple cider vinegar that the family used for pickling, cleaning, and seasoning through the entire next year. The technique relies on Acetobacter bacteria, naturally airborne everywhere apples grow. Your great-grandmother never bought vinegar in her life. The cost was zero. The product was superior to the diluted distilled white vinegar that came to dominate American shelves after World War II. It cannot be effectively regulated because it happens spontaneously when fruit is left to its own devices. Your grandmother could taste the difference between June vinegar and October vinegar. We have forgotten that vinegar even has seasons. Number 18. The home-cured tobacco patch. Second pattern break. Until 1937, Americans grew tobacco for personal use without restriction. The Marijuana Tax Act of that year was the first major federal intervention into agricultural plant restriction, and the Tobacco Inspection Act of 1935 had already begun federalizing what had been a household crop. Your great-grandfather grew a small patch of broadleaf tobacco behind the smokehouse, hung the leaves to cure in the rafters, and rolled his own cigarettes for pennies. The federal excise tax on tobacco products, which now adds dollars to every commercial pack, does not apply to tobacco grown and used by the same person on the same property. This is still legal. What ended the practice was not law but convenience. The rise of cheap mass-marketed cigarettes, funded by enormous advertising campaigns aimed specifically at rural Americans. The cigarettes sold today contain tobacco plus dozens of chemical additives never present in homegrown leaf. Number 17. The bartered chicken and the underground economy. During the Depression, formal money largely vanished from rural communities. Your great-grandparents participated in a parallel economy of barter that the IRS only began seriously trying to tax in the 1980s. A laying hen was traded for a sack of cornmeal. A bushel of apples bought a session with a visiting dentist. By 1982, the IRS had issued formal guidance that barter exchanges constitute taxable income. and barter networks were required to issue 1099B forms. Direct neighbor-to-neighbor barter for personal use remains legally ambiguous and largely unenforced, but the cultural infrastructure that made it work has been replaced by digital transactions. Your great-grandmother never wrote down what she owed Mrs. Henderson, she just remembered, and so did Mrs. Henderson. Number 16. The hand-pumped well at the kitchen door. Before electric pressure pumps, every farmstead had a hand pump bringing up cold, clean water from a hand-dug well 30 feet below. Your great-grandmother's pump worked through hurricanes, blizzards, and the Great Northeast Blackout of 1965 alike. It did not depend on the grid. The well casing was stone or brick, laid by hand by your great-grandfather over the course of a single summer, and that well delivered clean water for 60 years. Modern water well regulations in most states now require a licensed contractor for any new well. The actual effect is the elimination of the hand-dug well as a viable household option. A hand pump itself remains legal to install on an existing well. In any grid-down scenario, the family with a hand pump on a shallow well has water. The family with an electric submersible pump has decoration. Number 15. Home-rendered tallow soap and candle. Third pattern break. The American Standard Oil Company, through its various successors after the 1911 antitrust breakup, dominated kerosene lighting fuel by 1900 and aggressively positioned tallow candles as a backward and inferior product. The introduction of paraffin candles made from petroleum byproducts allowed the same industry to control both lighting fuels and the candle market. By 1940, home tallow candle production had nearly disappeared. Your great-grandmother dipped candles every November, repeatedly lowering twisted cotton wicks into a pot of melted beef tallow until each candle reached the desired thickness. The process produced candles that burned cleanly, smelled neutral, and cost nothing. What is restricted in many municipalities is the rendering itself, which now requires commercial kitchen permits in jurisdictions that have adopted the FDA food code. Personal use rendering on private property remains unregulated in most rural areas. The November butchering of one steer yields enough tallow for a year of soap and candles. Number 14. The ice house on the North Slope. In January, your great-grandfather and his neighbors cut blocks of ice from the frozen pond using a long crosscut saw, hauled them by sled to a small stone structure dug into the north-facing hillside, and packed them tight with sawdust. A properly built ice house held its ice from February through August. The packed sawdust acted as insulation. That ice preserved butter, cream, meat, and the family's milk through the hottest weeks of summer without electricity. Modern building codes in many counties now require permits for any permanent outdoor structure. For private family use, the practice remains legal. The knowledge of ice house construction is essentially gone from practical American memory. In any extended grid failure, the family with an ice house keeps food. The family without one watches it spoil. Number 13. The corn shuck mattress. Your great-grandmother stuffed her family's mattresses with dried corn shucks every September after the harvest. New shucks made a firm, supportive sleeping surface that did not retain dust mites, did not require manufactured materials, and cost nothing beyond the labor. A hand-sewn cotton tick held the shucks. The whole assembly could be unstitched, washed, and refilled in a single afternoon. Modern mattress regulations require fire-retardant chemical treatments and significant taxation through state recycling fees. None of this applies to a cotton tick mattress filled by the homeowner with farm materials. The chemical exposure from modern mattresses, particularly polybrominated diphenyl ether flame retardants, is now documented well enough that several states have begun banning specific compounds. Your great-grandmother slept on plant material that fed the chickens the next year. The loop was closed. Number 12. The pickling crock and lacto-fermentation cellar. Your great-grandmother filled a 5-gallon stoneware crock every September with shredded cabbage and salt, weighed it down with a clean stone, and let the wild lactobacillus bacteria do the work. 6 weeks later, the crock held sauerkraut that would last all winter. No vinegar, no canning, no heat processing, just salt, thyme, and the bacteria that live on every leaf. Lacto-fermented foods contain live probiotic cultures that the human gut microbiome evolved to expect. Modern food regulations technically permit home fermentation but prohibit its sale across state lines without prohibitively expensive certification. The result is that almost no commercially available sauerkraut is actually fermented. Most is preserved with vinegar and pasteurization, which kills the probiotic content entirely. Your great-grandmother's crock was a living ecosystem. Number 11. The home midwife and the kitchen birth. Fourth pattern break. Throughout the 19th century and into the 1930s, the majority of American children were born at home, attended by experienced midwives who were typically older women in the community with decades of practical knowledge. By 1955, hospital births had reached 95%. The shift was driven by aggressive lobbying from the American Medical Association beginning in the 1910s, which successfully campaigned in state after state to require physician attendance at births and to criminalize the practice of midwifery without medical licensure. Several states still classify direct entry midwifery as the unauthorized practice of medicine. The actual outcomes data, particularly for low-risk pregnancies, consistently shows that home birth attended by skilled midwives produces comparable or better outcomes than hospital birth on multiple measured variables, including rate of cesarean section, rate of episiotomy, and breastfeeding success at 6 months. Your great-grandmother gave birth to all 6 of her children at home, attended by Mrs. Peterson from down the road. She lost none of them. The knowledge that allowed that, the herbs, the positioning, the patience, the recognition of complication versus normal variation, was passed woman to woman across generations. It is now legally constrained in more than half the country. Number 10. The wood-fired bread oven. Your great-grandfather built a stone bread oven in the side yard over a single autumn weekend, using rounded field stones and clay mortar mixed with straw. The oven held heat for 8 hours after a single morning's fire of hardwood scrap. Your great-grandmother fired it on Saturday, baked the week's bread first while the oven was hottest, then pies and biscuits as the temperature dropped, and finally beans and stews overnight in the falling residual heat. A single firing produced a week of household food. Modern building codes in many counties require permits for any permanent outdoor structure with a chimney. For private rural use, the practice remains widely legal. A wood-fired oven produces bread with crust and crumb characteristics impossible to replicate in an electric oven. Number 9. The gleaning rite. In Depression-era rural America, gleaning, the gathering of crop remnants left in fields after harvest, was a recognized customary rite exercised by poor families with the property owner's tacit permission. Your great-grandmother gathered enough wheat from a neighbor's stubble field to make winter porridge for her family of 9. She gathered apples from a roadside orchard's drops, walnuts from along the township road, and elderberries from the hedgerows. None of this was theft. It traced back to medieval common law and was specifically named in the Book of Leviticus as a religious obligation of farmers. By 1970, modern liability law had effectively ended the practice. The customary rite remains nominally legal in some states, but the cultural infrastructure that made it work has been replaced by signs, fences, and prosecution. Your great-grandmother walked the township roads with a flour sack in October and came home with bushels of food. Number 8. The working horse before the tractor. In 1933, the average American farm of 160 acres was worked by a single team of horses and produced enough food to feed the farming family plus 6 urban families. By 1970, that same farm required a 90-horsepower tractor running on imported fuel, and the farming family could no longer afford to eat what they grew. The shift was driven by New Deal subsidies, John Deere advertising campaigns, and university extension programs that explicitly characterized horse farming as backward. Horses run on hay grown on the same farm rather than diesel imported from across the world. Your great-grandfather kept a team of Belgian draft horses until 1958. They produced manure for the garden. They reproduce themselves. There is no regulation against keeping working horses, but the entire infrastructure of harness makers, blacksmiths, and farriers has been hollowed out. Number 7. The moonshine still and the home distillation tradition. Fifth pattern break. Even after the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, home distillation of spirits remained, and remains, a federal felony in the United States, carrying penalties of up to $10,000 and 5 years in prison. The regulation exists to protect federal excise tax revenue. It has nothing to do with safety. The home brewing of beer and wine, by contrast, was federally legalized in 1978, and home cider making was always legal. The distinction is purely about which products produce significant excise tax revenue. Your great-grandfather operated a small still in the woodlot during Prohibition and continued more discreetly afterward, producing apple brandy from the orchard surplus that the family used as a winter tonic and the local doctor used as an antiseptic. The product was clean, traditional, and traceable to a specific orchard in a specific year. New Zealand legalized home distillation in 1996 with no measurable increase in alcohol-related harms. Several American states have introduced bills to permit small-scale home distillation. None has yet passed. Your great-grandfather did not need permission to convert his own apples into a shelf-stable medicine. Number 6. The buried potato clamp. Before refrigeration, your great-grandfather stored the autumn potato harvest in a structure called a clamp, a long mound of potatoes layered with straw, covered with more straw, and topped with soil and turf. A properly built clamp held 1,000 pounds of potatoes in dormant condition from October through April with no electricity. The straw allowed gas exchange, the earth covering provided thermal insulation. The technique is documented in agricultural literature back to the 1700s. There is no regulation against building a clamp. The knowledge simply disappeared from practical use because nobody was teaching it anymore. A potato clamp can be built in a single afternoon for the cost of straw bales. Your great-grandfather built one every November and dug into it through the winter as needed. Number 5. The kitchen herb pharmacy. Your great-grandmother kept a windowsill garden and a pantry shelf of dried herbs that constituted her family's primary medical pharmacy. Yarrow stopped bleeding, Plantain drew out splinters, elderberry syrup managed winter coughs, willow bark, the source of the active compound in aspirin, treated headaches and fevers, garlic poultices dealt with infections. These were not folk remedies in any superstitious sense. They were pharmacologically active plant medicines, whose mechanisms have since been documented in the scientific literature. The Flexner Report of 1910, funded by foundations whose pharmaceutical investments stood to benefit, resulted in the closure of the majority of American medical schools that taught botanical medicine. The FDA does not permit specific health claims for herbs, but it cannot make the plants illegal. Your great-grandmother did not make claims. She made tea, salve, and tincture. Number 4. The household composting loop. Your great-grandmother ran a closed nutrient loop on her property that any modern sustainability researcher would recognize as exemplary. Kitchen scraps fed the chickens, chicken manure went on the compost pile, compost fed the garden vegetables fed the family, nothing left the property as waste. Modern municipal regulations now require participation in waste collection systems in most incorporated areas, and several jurisdictions have passed ordinances against backyard composting under the rationale that it attracts pests. The actual driver behind these regulations has often been the political economy of municipal trash collection contracts. A family of 4 produces enough kitchen scraps to generate hundreds of pounds of finished compost per year. Your great-grandmother never bought a bag of fertilizer. She made better fertilizer than money could buy. Canned meat pantry. In November, after the butchering, your great-grandmother spent 3 days at the kitchen stove canning meat in glass jars using a heavy steel pressure canner. Beef, pork, venison, and chicken all went into quart jars with salt, processed at 15 pounds of pressure for 90 minutes. The result was shelf-stable meat that lasted up to 5 years on the pantry shelf and required no refrigeration, no freezer, and no electricity. A single butchering produced enough canned meat to feed the family through the entire next year. The technique is legal everywhere. What disappeared was the household infrastructure, the heavy canner, the case lots of glass jars, the willingness to convert raw materials into shelf-stable food rather than purchasing finished products. Your great-grandmother's pantry held 200 jars of meat. Her family ate well through the worst winters of the Depression. Number 2. The seed library. Every autumn, your great-grandmother saved seeds from the best plants in her garden, the largest tomatoes, the most flavorful beans, the squash that had survived the dry August. She labeled paper envelopes and stored them in a tin box. She traded seeds at church suppers and quilting bees. The varieties she grew had been selected by her mother and grandmother for the specific conditions of that specific farm. They were uniquely adapted, uniquely flavored, and uniquely hers. Today, a handful of corporations control over 60% of the global commercial seed supply. Patented hybrid and genetically modified seeds carry contractual prohibitions on saving and replanting, enforced by lawsuits against farmers found to have done so. Open-pollinated heirloom seeds remain legal to save and trade. Seed libraries now exist in all 50 states. The varieties she preserved, if lost, cannot be recovered. Number 1. Total household sovereignty. This is not a single trick. It is the philosophy that connects everything else on this list. Your great-grandfather's farm during the worst economic collapse in American history ran on sunlight, wood, water, and animal labor. He produced his own food, his own fuel, his own medicine, his own shelter, his own clothing materials, and his own seed for next year. He was not poor in any meaningful sense. He was sovereign. He owed nothing to a utility company because the rural electric grid had not yet reached him. He owed nothing to a seed company because the consolidated agricultural seed industry did not yet exist. He owed nothing to a grocery chain because the nearest one was 40 miles away and irrelevant to his calorie supply. He owed nothing to a pharmaceutical industry because his medicine grew on the windowsill. The entire infrastructure of modern American dependency, the grid, the municipal water system, the commercial food supply, the pharmaceutical supply chain, the licensed professional gatekeeping of every basic life skill, was built within living memory and sold to us as progress. It is progress in many ways. Hospitals save lives, refrigeration saves food, the grid keeps the lights on. But your great-grandfather understood something the generations after him forgot. A man who produces nothing is dependent on whoever produces everything. Every item on this list is a piece of recovered sovereignty. The egg crock and the hand pump close your protein and water loops. The smokehouse and the potato clamp give you food security through any winter. The herb garden gives you a medicine cabinet that does not depend on a supply chain. The seed library gives you a food future that no corporation can patent away from your grandchildren. None of this is fantasy. None of this is prepping paranoia. It is how your family lived for the entire length of American history before the last 70 years. Your great-grandparents knew all of it. We forgot it in 3 generations because forgetting was profitable for someone else. Here is your challenge. Pick one, just one. Start a sourdough starter this week from flour and water on your kitchen counter. Plant a single row of open-pollinated heirloom seeds this spring. Buy a used pressure canner at an estate sale and learn to use it. Find a neighbor who keeps chickens and ask them how they started. Tell me in the comments which one you are trying first. Tell me if your great-grandparents did any of these, because I promise you, somebody in your family tree knew every last trick on this list. That knowledge did not die. It just went quiet. It is time to start listening again.